Thanks, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm a assistant professor in the Department of Geography here at CU. And today I want to talk to you about a research project that my former master's student, Rees, and I completed a couple years ago that relates to sedimentation and carbon accretion or carbon accrual in that sediment in beaver ponds and their implications, potential implications of our data for restoration. So you've heard this before. It's nice to have some of these sort of bigger intro talks before this talk. But Beaver promotes sedimentation and carbon storage in river corridors or channels, floodplains, and the hyporheic zone. And they promote lateral connectivity, so channel to floodplain connectivity, and have the potential to, say, reconnect incised streams or degraded streams to their floodplains. But this figure from Pollock et al. Demonstrates that sort of progression, but that progression and this reconnection really requires sedimentation. It requires sediment storage. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And also, beaver ponds and the sediment within those ponds tend to store a high amount of carbon, either in particulate organic matter or carbon that's stuck to clays and silts within those ponds. And they also, beaver ponds also tend to attenuate sediment fluxes after disturbance, for example, fire. And here's a figure from a recent paper from Sarah Rathburn's work that discusses that. But as we know, beaver populations were massively reduced. After European arrival, their current numbers are very low compared to where they were previously. And this indicates that we really do need more data to estimate current storage of sediment in beaver ponds and carbon associated with that sediment. And we also need data in order to be able to potentially predict what might change on the landscape if beaver were allowed to repopulate or were reintroduced on the landscape. Another aspect of this that is interesting is that there is increased interest in carbon storage in river corridors. So here we have a figure of a river corridor with few human alterations, showing carbon stored in sediment or soil, standing vegetation or above ground biomass, and downed wood. And down at the bottom are some examples of how we have significantly altered river corridors, including removed beaver, that have likely reduced that carbon storage on the landscape. So carbon storage is a potential benefit of restoration approaches. And there's been a lot of interest, I think, in this, also in the idea of carbon credits for repairing restoration, so funding restoration through the selling of carbon credits. But this means that we really need to better understand carbon dynamics in rivers and the effect of beaver on carbon, for example. And so, this interest has significant implications for beaver and beaver mimicry in stream restoration. So, previous studies have indicated that beaver ponds store sediment. We actually have relatively limited data on sedimentation rates. So how fast do ponds accumulate sediment and the associated carbon? We also have still relatively limited data across two different timescales, so short-term sedimentation rates, but we have some data on long-term sort of Holocene, thousands of years, how do beaver grade sediment within a valley bottom. But I would also say we lack data on ponds that tend to be more persistent or sort of repopulated by beaver on the landscape. So we don't understand sort of the decadal timescale, which may be particularly important for management decisions if we're thinking about ways to store sediment and carbon on the landscape. So here are a couple of figures from some papers that relate sediment volumes or sedimentation rates, aggradation rates of sediment versus pond age. And you can see that there's limited data with more persistent ponds or ponds that are abandoned and repopulated, for example. So the questions that we wanted to ask is what is the rate of sedimentation and sediment-associated carbon accretion in beaver ponds, trying to extend the time scale of our understanding. So thinking about all different kinds of ponds and how of various ages. And also, can we estimate, using field data, field-derived data, can we estimate how long it would take to reconnect incised channels to their floodplains through beaver-related sedimentation? And so we conducted this work at a couple of sites in a critical zone network that we're a part of on two streams, Trout Creek shown on the top there and Coal Creek in the middle. And we have multiple reaches within each of these streams. And here I'm highlighting sort of a classification of what those reaches look like geomorphically. So on Trout Creek, most of Trout Creek and most of the ponds on Trout Creek are incised. And so we have this terrace and an eroding bank and an incised kind of entrenched stream channel on Trout Creek. On Coal Creek, we have more, most of the beaver ponds that we assessed were either located in beaver meadows, which was referred to before, but sort of a multi-thread, well-connected valley bottom with lots of ponds, or they were also located on ponds off-channel. And this becomes important later on when we start thinking about sedimentation rates. So I just want to draw a contrast between incised streams, but also reaches and incised reaches, and lower energy environments such as beaver meadows or off-channel ponds. Okay, so we measured sediment depths in 45 ponds. This is a lot of work that Huck and others and myself contributed to. We collected sediment to determine carbon content, so the percent of carbon by mass in that sediment grain size, and we also estimated a carbon stock, so a mass of carbon stored on the landscape. Here's a picture of Huck coring a particular sticky pond in Coal Creek. And then we also looked at the aerial photo record to assess pond age, and this is how we're getting at our sedimentation rates. So how old is the pond, how much sediment is stored, what's the rate of aggradation in that pond. We also used a method of dating called short-lived radionuclides and radiocarbon dating, and what these methods do is leverage the timescale of radioactive decay of different isotopes to help us understand sedimentation rates and the age of sediment in ponds. So what did we find? We found, I'm just going to give you a couple highlights from the project. Here we have a plot of sedimentation rate on the y-axis and pond age on the x-axis on Coal Creek and Trout Creek. And we found that the integrated sedimentation rates, and I'm calling them integrated because we're not able to understand sort of the full history of the sediment in that pond. There might be scour and fill, but we're measuring a sediment depth and we're assigning an age to it and getting one sort of integrated rate. But we find that it decreases dramatically with pond age, and this is likely due to ponds filling to capacity and maybe being abandoned by beaver over time. There might be a signature of sort of repeat scouring and filling in these data too of the sediment behind beaver ponds or behind beaver dams. But I do want to point out that the data set that we have has extended the time scale of our data sets that we currently understand for beaver ponds and sedimentation rates. Okay, so we can these are linear scale data. We can plot this on a log scale, and we can create statistical relationships where we relate sedimentation rate on the y-axis to pond age, and this provides a way to sort of estimate and predict sedimentation rate with pond age if we're thinking about trying to estimate sedimentation and sediment storage across the landscape. Our median sedimentation rate is about 6 centimeters per year, okay, across these data. And we also use these short-lived radionuclides, this dating method that uses radioactive decay. And a couple of things I want to point out here. We have depth on the y-axis, and the top row is one sediment core of an older pond that we cored, and then the bottom row is another one. And these are both on Trout Creek in those incised reaches, okay, those kind of entrenched reaches. And we also found a couple of pieces of organic matter that we used radiocarbon dating to date. And here what we see, sort of big take home, is if we look at an age plot over here, we see that the top 10 to 20 centimeters of sediment in both of these ponds is really young. It's about 1 to 3 years old, okay? And then that sort of young sediment is sitting on top of older sediment, which we know through our radiocarbon dates here at different depths. And so what we interpret this as is evidence of scour and fill. So that pond that we cored stored sediment, but that has been sort of episodically removed and then stored again, and removed and stored. And I think an interesting thing here is that these fallout radionuclides and radiocarbon dating can help us understand the retention timescale and also the fate of particular packets of sediment over time in beaver ponds. And this says sour and fill, but I mean scour and fill. So we found that there's the episodic scour and fill dynamics from these dating methods that we employed really helps explain the rapid reduction of this integrated sedimentation rate over time. And so there's a pretty steep decline in sedimentation rates as ponds get older because it's sort of keeping the signature of removal and deposition. So, these cores are on Trout Creek. I do want to draw a little bit of a distinction, and I think this is important from a management context, that there seems to be differences in sedimentation dynamics or sedimentation characteristics depending on the geomorphic context. So in Coal Creek, which the ponds were in beaver meadows or off-channel ponds, we found more evidence of continuous sedimentation. So here on the top left is sediment depth versus pond age. The older ponds got, the deeper the sediment got. And we see a less steep decline in sedimentation rates with pond age here, which indicates that there's more continuous sedimentation processes. So this speaks to the importance of, if a management goal is to store sediment on the landscape, is to reduce incision on a landscape, that it's important to think about low energy environments to promote continuous sediment deposition. So this could be things like trying to reduce incision initially to create lower energy environments. It speaks to the importance of avulsion processes, or the ability of the river channel to create a side channel and shift its location to create, so beaver may be able to create off-channel ponds that then store sediment and carbon. And the idea that in order to reduce incision, you have to store sediment, and incised streams, it takes a while to aggrade those incised streams, has been around in the literature. But I think the unique part of our research project is that we've begun to quantify these rates and to better understand how all the factors work together to, say, for example, predict different timescales of reducing incision. And to that effect, we have this sort of big field data set, right, where we looked at sedimentation rates versus pond age. And so what we could then do is Huck employed a Monte Carlo simulation, a sort of statistical method where we have distributions of our data, and we can sample from those distributions 100,000 times and try to estimate how long it would take to reconnect an incised channel with sedimentation due to beaver activity. And this figure on the top sort of demonstrates what this approach does. If we take one of our reaches that's highly incised, and we use our field data, we use the aerial photo data that can tell us, okay, how long are these ponds inundated versus not inundated? Can we move to this morphology, which is sort of a well-connected channel floodplain environment, maybe wetter, for example, stores more carbon, stores more sediment? How long would that take with the field data and our relationships between sedimentation rate and pond age? And we found that it can take quite a long time. So this is a frequency distribution, a histogram of, out of all of these simulations, how much time would it take to fill in a channel? And the median of that is 96 years, and the range is quite large, right? So this is just an important thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about incised channels and trying to understand how beaver recolonization or beaver mimicry structures would potentially result in aggradation. So we also estimated carbon accretion rates or carbon accrual, sequestration on the landscape in sediment. And we had a wide range of those because we had a wide range of sedimentation rates. But these rates are higher than many rates published within floodplain environments. So, ponds do have the potential to store quite a bit of carbon pretty quickly. But I think it's important to note that constraining fluxes or inputs and outputs of carbon is really important for understanding how, say, restoration might change carbon storage on the landscape. And this sediment signature, this sediment stock of carbon, might take quite a while to accrue, and that sort of timescale needs to be accounted for. I recently worked with a human geographer who works on markets for ecosystem services, Rebecca Lave, to think about river restoration in the context of carbon markets. And this figure comes from a recent commentary piece that we did, where, if we think about restoration, we can shift baseline carbon storage conditions by creating wetter environments with finer sediment storage and wood storage and storage and standing biomass. But if the community is interested in selling carbon credits to fund river restoration, we really need to have a better understanding of how all of these inputs and outputs of carbon at a river reach scale come together to assess, result in a change in storage. And so I think that's a really important piece to point out. So just to summarize, we found different relationships between sedimentation rates and pond age, depending on geomorphic context, so incised streams versus sort of lower energy reaches. We found evidence of scour and fill dynamics in these incised streams, trying to sort of understand and date individual sediment packets with radionuclides. We found relatively long time periods for reconnecting incised channels to floodplains using a large field-based data set. And there's a high potential for carbon accretion or carbon storage within ponds. And field data can really help us understand and predict timescales of beaver modifications for restoration goals and what might need to happen in a river reach to sort of get things going, right? What would need to happen in order to actually retain sediment and aggrade channels? And speaking of prediction, I just want to end by talking about an ongoing project led by Joel Schultes at CU Boulder and CMU, where we're working with a master's student to incorporate beaver dams in numerical modeling approaches and trying to assess and predict watershed-scale sediment storage, say, for example, upstream of a reservoir that has sedimentation problems. This is the Paonia Reservoir shown here. And so we're working on these questions, but in addition to extending timescales of understanding, we also want to extend across spatial scales. So think about watersheds, for example. So with that, I just want to thank our collaborators and funding for the project that I talked to you today. And if there's time, I'm not sure if there is, but I'm happy to take questions. Thanks. Yeah, there's 2 minutes. So yeah, maybe one question. None of the study sites were in recent wildfire scars. So yeah, and I think it would, one of Sarah Rathburn's former master's students has a fire-specific sedimentation study that I noted, done et al. So yeah, that might be interesting to you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, the question was, how do I account for compaction of sediment in the ponds? And yeah, that's a great question. That might also be part of this sort of lower sedimentation rate over pond age. And that's why we wanted to go after this radionuclide dating to try to understand more about the fate of individual sediment packets. And yeah, I think that when we estimated mass, we tried to account for we sampled and accounted for differences in bulk density to some extent. But yeah, I'm happy to talk about that more. So is it time to change, or is there one more question? Okay, in the back. Thanks. what's the main challenge of sampling in the field? I'm looking at my graduate student, Huck. I think that, there's a lot of spatial variability within a pond and sediment depths. So beaver, as we all know, are active managers of their landscape, and they move stuff around, and they, push sediment. And so I think, just ensuring that the measurements that we take accurately represent spatial variability means that we have to take some time and think about how we sample, and getting stuck is a potential. It has happened. Do field work with other people. Thank you.
Thank you so much.